some of them will be quite open and say, well, if we could get a true Conservative Party, then great, then we'll have done our job. And others say, well, no, the Tory Party is irredeemable, and we are out to destroy them. And they look at what's happening, I don't know, in Holland or in with the AFD in Germany, and they think we'll have some of that.
Tom, you've been looking into Reform UK, which weirdly isn't really a political party. It's a business which is basically owned by Nigel Farage. What do you think is going on? Will he stick with Reform UK? Will he switch to the Tories? Ultimately, Rishi Sunak as the leader has control over who can stand as a candidate. So actually it's in his gift as to whether or not Nigel Farage could run as a Tory candidate. What's your reading of what's going on, Tom?
I think he is just keeping his options open. He's flirting with us, isn't he? He's just such a great self-publicist. And so I don't think he's made up his mind. I mean, there are some in the Reform Party who say, look, ultimately he won't be able to resist being Donald Trump's wingman in the United States, because that's probably the route to earning the most money, right? That's where he can go and stand on stage with tens of thousands of people at these rallies. So there's that challenge. How is he going to do in the jungle? Will people take to him or not? But I don't think he's ruled it out, has he? I mean, he went into the jungle and delivered a message, not just sort of in conversation with somebody, but directly to camera, saying, will I ever lead the Conservative Party? Never say never. So he clearly wants to keep that option open.
Even I think he referred to himself as the third person, which in itself should be I think probably a hanging offence. What's your reading of this, Rachel? Because certain parts of the Conservative Party worry what Nigel Farage is always up to. But if you look at the polls, they are losing votes to the Labour Party as well as to Reform. And the risk is they turn more to Reform. It just ends up alienating more people out to the centrist voters who will go to the Labour Party.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, in a way, Nigel Farage has always been interesting for his influence on the Conservative Party from outside it rather than in it. So, that was arguably it was he who got the Brexit referendum, but not from within the Tory party. And I think what's interesting now is that the Tory party seems to be moving towards reform. Whether or not Nigel Farage rejoins, the next election for the Tory leader will be in that direction. So Suella Braverman has made pretty clear she's going to stand. Kemi Badenoch as well on the sort of woke warrior platform. At the Tory conference, all the candidates who you might think would be in that leadership contest were trying to appeal to the kind of right of the party, and they're becoming narrower and narrower the more the base shrinks. The less representative they're going to be of the wider electorate. And I think long term, that's very dangerous for the Conservative Party.
I was just looking at the polling, actually. The latest YouGov poll has got Labour on 45%, the Tories on 22%. But interestingly, the Tories are holding on to 55% of their vote from last time around. 15% of their vote is going to the Labour Party. 20% is going to Reform. So you can see why they're nervous, that actually of those voters from 2019, that's worrying them more. I suppose the issue is that the Labour Party is picking up votes from the Tories and loads of Lib Dem voters as well, and hanging on to lots of its own vote. Tom, there's an interesting question that you pose as to what the point of Reform UK is. Is it to destroy the Tory party and replace it? Is it just to keep it constantly under pressure? And actually, if after, as the polls currently look, a Labour victory, if after that the Tories do shift to a sort of Suella Braverman Conservative Party, then there's no point to Reform UK, is there?
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is what's so fascinating once you start talking to people in Reform, and they have different ideas of what the party is ultimately for. Some of them will be quite open and say, well, if we could get a true Conservative Party, then great, then we'll have done our job. And others say, well, no, the Tory party is irredeemable, and we are out to destroy them. And they look at what's happening, I don't know, in Holland or in with the AFD in Germany, and they think we'll have some of that. If we keep going, maybe there can be another one of these revolutions, and we can we can destroy the Tory party and become the main centre-right party. And then there's Nigel Farage there flirting with, all of these different options. And I think to some extent that undermines reform. And if you speak to some, I think, smart Tory strategists, they'll say, look, if you look at those 15% of voters that have left the Conservative Party directly for Labour, they count double for the 20% who are going to reform, because you lose a vote in your constituency and your main challenger gains one. Whereas if it goes to reform, it doesn't really make a difference if one of your voters goes to reform or just doesn't vote at all. And so they really need to keep their focus on Labour. But also there was an interesting point that they made, that those who are going to reform now are your kind of ultra Tories, your most hardline, your Suella Braverman supporters. And so they are also the most opposed to the prospect of a woke Keir Starmer government coming in. So the Conservative Party are quite hopeful that as the election approaches, they'll be really able to squeeze reform back down to something like 3 or 4%, which might be manageable for them.
The other point you made in your piece, Tom, is that lots of people who think they're going to support reform might not realise this, but reform's pitch, their long-term plan is proportional representation. That actually the best outcome for reform is probably a minority Labour government forced to give the Lib Dems PR, which would then, in a future election, give Reform a toehold in Parliament. So actually, an outright Labour or Conservative win is the worst thing that could happen for them.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you speak to Richard Tice, the leader of Reform, he's absolutely clear on that point. The goal now is proportional representation. I think it's Nigel Farage's goal as well. And if you think about how Nigel Farage came to be such a dominant player in British politics, it comes back all the way, ironically, to Tony Blair's constitutional reforms in, I think, 1998 or 1999, where he introduced proportional representation for elections to the European Parliament. This is the first time that proportional representation had been used for UK-wide elections. And it's from that moment that Nigel Farage joins the European Parliament at the same time, interestingly enough, as Nick Clegg. And obviously, without that, we would have never had the sort of YouTube sensation that became Nigel Farage. So they are, closely intertwined, going back a couple of decades now. But Reform are not united on this. Anne Widdecombe, one of their leading figures, has got an opt-out from campaigning for proportional representation. She says it's appalling. They're not even united on that one question.
And if you think about it, our electoral system has meant that we've always had coalitions within parties. But what Boris Johnson did was he purged the moderates from the Conservative Party. So he drove the Tories more towards that reform, fragmented direction. So I think there's sort of bigger forces at play in a way.